Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. In this video, we're going to talk about psychoanalytic literary criticism. Now, the first thing I want to say, the crucial warning, is that even though I will frequently refer to this as psychoanalysis, what I'm talking about here is literary criticism, an approach to reading and interpreting texts. Psychoanalysis as an actual clinical practice is a legitimate form of psychological therapy. Someone like me who does psychoanalytic literary criticism is not qualified to practice psychotherapy. There's a big difference between psychoanalytic literary criticism, which is a structure for reading or a methodology for reading, and psychological or psychoanalytic practice. Don't think that because you have read a little bit of Freud and Jung and Lacan, you can practice psychology. It is very dangerous to practice psychology. If you do not know what you're doing, please do not do it. Disclaimer over. So, psychoanalytic literary criticism. As the name suggests, this is a methodology that develops out of the discipline of psychoanalysis, developed by Sigmund Freud and Joseph Breuer in the mid to late 1800s as their talking therapy. The idea of psychoanalysis as a clinical discipline or therapeutic discipline is essentially that the mind is complex, layered, and multifaceted, and by understanding hidden drives, desires, objectives, etc., we can help people work through neuroses, through anxieties, etc. Again, that's the therapy. Psychoanalytic literary criticism is a methodology that picks up from the principles of psychoanalysis and applies them to texts in order to develop and understand more deeply the ways in which literature reflects the human psyche. And Freud himself wrote a good amount about literature. So the earliest psychoanalytic practitioners did write about literature and drew inspiration from literary texts. So this is a long and well-developed tradition. One of the cool things about psychoanalytic literary criticism is that it's not an exclusive methodology. It's not an exclusive framework. Instead, it gives us a set of interpretive tools, which means that other types of theorists, other types of scholars, Marxists, feminists, post-colonialists, etc., can pick up the principles of psychoanalytic literary criticism and utilize them effectively to expand their own approaches. So Slavoj Žižek, for instance, combines traditional Marxist criticism with Lacanian psychoanalysis. Frantz Fanon the great post-colonial critic, combined post-colonialism with particularly Freudian psychology. A number of feminists have combined Freudian and Lacanian and Jungian psychology with the disciplines of feminism. Hélène Cixous, for instance, has work that draws from psychoanalysis. And so the tools of psychoanalytic, and feminists are also generally quite critical of psychoanalysis. So that's worth noting as well as other groups, Marxists and post-colonialists and critical race scholars and others. But that's one of the cool things about psychoanalysis is, like close reading, I mean, new criticism you can't combine with other things, but that tool of close reading is something that other scholars, other lenses for critical reading and interpretation can pick up. Psychoanalysis, same kind of thing, but pretty much across the board. You can also just do straight psychoanalytic literary criticism, where you read a text for its psychological components. So what I want to do, there's three sort of big voices that lay the foundations for psychoanalytic literary criticism. That's Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Jacques Lacan. I want to go through some of their big ideas, some of the big ideas that each of these guys gave us, and just sort of explain them and how we read for them in literary studies. Film studies actually is a really big one as well. There's a lot of film criticism that draws on psychoanalytic principles. So if we start with Freud, some of the big things, these are not the big things necessarily from a psychoanalytic treatment perspective, but from a literary perspective. The triple structure of the id, the ego, and the superego is very, very important in terms of understanding character motivation, understanding how characters behave, as well as understanding the relationships between sets of characters. So the id basically is the part of the psyche that is driven by desire, that's driven by impulse. So the part of us that wants to be violent, that wants to be sexually promiscuous, that wants to eat all of the food, etc., etc., that's the id, the animalistic drives, if you will. The ego is the rational part of the brain that says, we cannot do all of the things that we want to do all of the time. We need to save money for tomorrow. We can't just go and spend it all on booze and hookers or whatever it is our impulse is to do. We can't punch this traffic cop who's giving us a parking ticket, etc., because there will be negative consequences for that. So the ego is associated with what Freud calls the reality principle. The idea that reality puts constraints on how we behave if we don't want to die, be horribly inconvenienced in whatever way. The id is associated with what Freud calls the pleasure principle, the idea that we want to pursue enjoyment for its own sake, regardless of consequences. And so those two forces are constantly in conflict within the psyche. The third force in Freud's structure is the superego. And the superego is internalized guilt. It is the internalized cop who presumes that you have done something wrong, something for which you should feel guilty. And so even if you have done something that's not wrong and you feel guilty about it, that's your superego. So that's your three-part structure. And then we, again, as readers of texts, can analyze these things. You take a text like Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for instance. This is the archetypal text. Pay attention to that word, because archetypal is coming back later. But this is the archetypal text that splits the ego or the superego and the id. Hyde is id. He does what he wants, violent sexual consumption of whatever substances because he wants to. Jekyll is superego. He is guilt. He is repression personified. And prior to the split, he is ego. He is the rational figure. So we can read characters through this structure. Freud also gives us the idea of the Oedipus complex or the related Electra complex. And this derives not necessarily directly from the Oedipus myth, most famous from Sophocles' play from the ancient Greeks, but it derives from Freud's idiosyncratic reading of the Oedipus myth. And basically the idea of the Oedipus complex, and the Electra complex works on the same principle, except it's a girl's desire for her father, and rivalry with her mother. But that's the Oedipus complex, is a young boy's sexual desire for his mother and rivalry with his father because the father gets to enjoy the mother sexually. This is not necessarily always as direct as this. For psychoanalytic literary criticism, any father-son tension, particularly tension over some third object, some desired goal or objective, can be read in terms of the Oedipus complex, and it's a way of understanding how intergenerational conflict occurs. The other big one we get from Freud that's relevant to literary criticism is castration complex. And this is essentially it's not as simple and direct and straightforward as I'm worried that someone will cut my testicles off. It's a character's or an author's fear of loss of something constitutive of their identity. That is something central to how they understand themselves as a person. And so that anxiety drives a lot of characters. That fear of some kind of loss that will make them less than whole. That's really, really central to literary works. So those are some of the big ones from Freud. Freud's disciple, who later sort of split with him, was Carl Jung. And Jung takes a different kind of approach than Freud because Jung becomes interested. So Freud is primarily interested in individual psychology, in the way the individual mind works. Jung becomes much more interested in collective psychology or communal psychology. And so he develops the idea of the collective unconscious, which is this idea that there's a general set of influences or set of ideas that are fundamental to the way that humans encounter the world, the way that we make stories for ourselves to understand the world. And central to this collective unconscious, according to Jung and his followers, is a bank of archetypes. So archetypes are generally recognizable symbols that tend to be more or less cross-cultural. Most cultures have some version of them, and they represent generally similar things across cultures. So the triad of the virgin, the wife, or the mother, and the crone. This is a very, very common symbol across cultures, not universal not as universal as Jungians sometimes want to suggest, but it is very, very common across cultures. The idea of death personified is an archetype. It's something that generally exists across cultures. And so Jung attributes this to the idea of the collective unconscious. That is, there's something shared, maybe evolutionary, maybe just inherent, whatever it is. We all have a shared set of images, stories, knowledge, etc., that helps us to make sense of the world in these collective ways, these shared ways. The third big figure in psychoanalytic literary criticism is Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst from the mid-20th century. And for film studies, Lacan is really the big one, I think. Like most film studies practitioners who work with psychoanalysis, in my experience, are Lacanians primarily. So Lacan picks up Lacan himself actually said that he didn't come up with anything. He just reread Freud. Lacan said that everything that he ever said, Freud had said before. That's not necessarily true, because what Lacan does that really radically changes what Freud had done is Lacan puts psychoanalytic techniques and psychoanalytic principles into the context of structuralism and linguistics. Lacan actually said the unconscious is structured like a language. And so what that does for literary critics is it makes it much easier to translate principles that are originally designed for psychoanalytic treatment into questions of how we read. So Lacan has some big insights that really shape literary criticism. We have another three-part structure, which is the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. Lacan says that these are sort of three different ways in which the mind encounters everything, or the mind makes sense of everything that exists. The level of the imaginary is the pre-verbal level, the non-verbal level. It tends to be the level of images, of sensations, of fantasy, of desire, etc., etc. The symbolic, which is really where a lot of the work of literary criticism focuses, the symbolic is the sphere of language and of symbols, of semiotics. So this is the sphere where we make meaning in linguistic ways. And one of the points that Lacan makes, which is, again, central to a discipline like deconstruction as well, is that language always fails to grasp the full meaning of what we are trying to convey. Language is always inadequate to convey our full meaning. And then the third component of this is the real. And the real is a space beyond language. It is sort of, it's hard to really describe the real because Lacan talks about it in different ways, and then subsequent Lacanian theorists talk about it in different ways. But the way that I understand it is this sort of terrifying non-space beyond language. It's the stuff that language fails to convey. And the very existence of the real is often a terrifying thing because it highlights for us as psychological subjects how limited our ability to make meaning out of the world is. So we got that three-part structure. Again, the symbolic and the real are actually the things that in my experience, literary critics and film critics talk the most about, because these are the symbolic is the way that we understand and convey meaning, and the real is what escapes meaning. And so those are very important for the arts. Another big concept from Lacan is the objet petit a, or objet a, or object small a, or object a. So objet petit a is the most common way I think of referring to it in French. Again, that means object small a. This deals with Lacan's notion of the economy of desire, of how desire drives the subject. So essentially, the objet petit a is the thing that we think that we desire, but Lacan's insight is that what we actually desire is desire itself. So I think that I want a tenure track job teaching literature at a small liberal arts college in New England where it's autumn all of the time. if I actually got that, what I would find is that's not what I actually wanted. What I wanted was the wanting itself. As Spock says in Star Trek, very often the having of a thing is not as pleasing as the wanting. It's not logical, but it's oftentimes true. This is the principle of the objet petit a. So I think that I want this thing, and then I will be happy. But when I get that thing, I find that I'm not happy. I still feel that my desire is unfulfilled. This is the premise behind really addiction, right? Like if you're a compulsive shopper or compulsive gambler or something like that, if I buy that one item, I will be happy and I will feel complete. If I win that one hand of poker, I will be happy and feel complete, etc., etc. But what you really want, because we as psychological subjects are inherently incomplete. And for Lacan, this is what happens when we enter language, when we enter the symbolic order. Something of us is lost. For Lacan, this is the cut or castration. Lacan uses the term castration in a different sense than Freud does, though they're related. But the idea that we have lost something, that prior to entering the symbolic order, the order of language, and the order where meaning inherently fails to capture everything that we want to convey, that we were or believed that we were more existentially whole. That's what the objet petit a is about. It is about, if I can just get this thing, I will feel existentially whole again. But because we as subjects are constituted by that need for something, it is in fact the need itself that's significant. And so this is a really useful framework for thinking about literary texts, film, etc., because we can analyze what a character thinks they want, what they are attempting to achieve, versus what they really want. How have they misrecognized what the object of their desire is? So this is by no means an exhaustive list of the ideas and concepts of psychoanalytic literary criticism, but these are some of the key things. I know this video is getting a little bit long. I love psychoanalytic literary criticism, so I went a little bit on, but the great strength of psychoanalytic literary criticism is it roots us in how characters, or more occasionally even how authors, understand the world and their desires and why they do the things they do. So this gives us tools to understand or come to terms with motivation. There are significant problems with psychoanalytic literary criticism. And again, feminists have been one of the biggest quarters from which critique has come, because Freud especially, but also Jung and Lacan, have very, very gendered understandings of the mind and psychology. Lacan has a very logocentric and phallocentric understanding of how language and meaning function. And so feminists have been very, very critical of the erasure or the downplaying of women's distinct experience within the psychoanalytic tradition. Another big criticism that's come from a number of quarters, including Marxism, post-colonialism, critical race studies, etc., is that, and postmodernism particularly, is that psychoanalysis tends to universalize its concepts. So Freud says this is the structure of the mind. He doesn't account for the fact that in different cultural contexts, different sociological contexts, etc., mental structures may be different. Freud simply doesn't account for that. He doesn't acknowledge or understand that. And later critics come along and say, well, you have looked at European middle-class people, you haven't necessarily established that these are universal mental structures. So these are the things. Psychoanalysis, again, is a great set of tools that scholars from across disciplines can utilize in order to understand how texts explore psychology and the presentation and motivation of characters, but there are some significant limitations, particularly if we're looking at this beyond middle-class European, particularly white-authored texts.